This week, we'll be making a game board that can be used for sci-fi or fantasy war games. So the goal for this board was to serve as a cinematic battlefield for my Star Wars Legion game. But being the size that I was planning, I decided I wanted to be able to reuse it across sci-fi, fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, and any kind of wargaming. So I got planning. First off, we're going to head to our local Bunnings, our classic Australian hardware store. We're going to need some foam as well as the base and a frame. So we're back from Bunnings with all the bits and pieces that we need. Additionally, I got some grouts, glues and plaster of Paris that I'm going to use later in the build, as well as a watertight drop sheet to help keep all the mess of this project contained. So let's get building. We're going to lay everything out and start measuring it up so we can cut the frame to size. And then after a quick dry fit to make sure everything was cut down properly and will fit together nicely, I start nailing everything in place. Just putting down a few small nails to begin to make sure that everything fits where it should, and then later on coming back in with a whole lot more. And repeating this process for the other parts of the frame. At this point, I bring in the original foam to test fit it all and get the measurements to fill in this gap. Using a tape measure with this foam is easy because you can just push the end in to make a marking, then use some of your leftover scraps to make a nice straight line. Now for the hard part. If you don't have a foam cutter, this stuff can be quite difficult to cut in straight lines. The trick is to cut, not try and push the blade through. So once you've cut about halfway through, you should be able to snap it off well enough that we'll be able to disguise this with filler. Next stage is to glue all the foam down. Unfortunately, what I had used wasn't foam safe, so be very careful with the glues or liquid nails that you use for this kind of thing, because they can actually melt away at the foam. I managed to deal with this with a bit of filler later on, but if you use something really severe, it might destroy your build. In addition to the liquid nails, I also used a smattering of PVA glue to help the whole thing bond down, before bringing in the original foam piece and pressing everything down. And then repeating the process again with the liquid nails and the wood glue for the second piece of foam. And giving this a good push down for a nice tight fit, before taking it outside and adding some more glue to fill in the gaps, before leaving it to dry in the sun. And now for the second stage, to design the second layer of cliffs. This was definitely the hardest part because I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with this board. So I started by just chopping up a whole heap of this foam and placing the pieces around the board in various ways, seeing if I could design something that I liked the look of. And once I was fairly happy with my layout, and I could feel a few different ways for it to be used in fantasy or sci-fi games, I decided it was time to start sticking everything down. This time I avoided the liquid nails as I knew it would affect the foam in a negative way. So with a combination of wood glue and hot glue, I stuck everything down. In the past, I've warned against using wood glue with these foams, but over the last year or two, this product has become more and more porous, becoming harder to use for modeling purposes, but causing the glue to soak in and dry a lot better. And now that most of the flat surfaces have been stuck down, I'm going to give the whole thing a run with the heat gun to help bring the flat surfaces into a more natural random feel. Before finally adding in this ramp that I'm designing to fit with a couple of possible bridges that I already have in my terrain set. When building ramps for these kinds of boards, it's very important to consider the slope and make sure that your miniatures can actually stand on the hill. And we'll give that a night to dry with some weights on it to keep everything down before mixing up some homemade Scultamold to really blend in all of those harsh edges. Once I've got that mixed up to a nice muddy consistency, I just start slapping it all over the board and really trying to blend in all of the areas that I feel don't look too natural and get a nice smooth edge for any of these ramps that I want my miniatures to be able to walk up. This is the chance to add a real deep earth layer and try and fill in any of those obviously foam and unnatural gaps that have occurred while you've built this board. Additionally, it's a good time to really slap it on and make some new ramps from any areas that you've just piled up a few different layers of contour. This is one of the most messy but more fun parts of the build, as you really see it change from a pile of foam into something natural and smooth. As the Scultamold mix starts to dry, you've got a chance to really work it, especially with wet hands, to smooth out any of the edges and bring it down nice and soft. And after a few rounds of the Scultamold, we're already seeing this start to have a much more natural shape. To fill in the cliff faces, however, we're going to mix up some plaster of Paris and use these Woodland Scenics rock molds. Essentially, with this one mold, I could make a whole heap of different variations just by pouring it at different heights and breaking it up, then coming in with some glue to stick it to the edges. Ultimately, using glue was a poor idea. You'll see very soon a much better result from using the Scultamold mix and slapping it on, as this fills in all of the gaps and really brings the whole thing to life. So I mixed up some more Scultamold, and this time off camera adding in a heap of PVA to really help it stick, and using this to fill in all the gaps left by the glue. And now it's time to paint these rock surfaces. So I decided to give the Leopard spotting technique a go. This is essentially watering down some cheap acrylic paints and then just blotching them all over the plaster. The fun with this is that you can use some really bright colors in the first few layers, and by the end they look incredibly natural, bringing in a really nice variation to the rock that we see in the real world. In this case, I've decided to go with a bright yellow because, well, why not? Once the first layer of the brightest colors are down, I came in with two more colors of varying darknesses of brown. These really help to pull down the brightness of that yellow, as well as bringing a more earthy tone. By continuing around the board, adding more and more variations and combinations of these colors in different blotchy spot techniques, I eventually covered everything in a supernatural, random looking rock. And after a day of drying, it's time to bring it back inside and fill in any gaps. So I mix up some Scultamold, slap it on the back of some of my rock molds, and then just push these up against the cliff face where I want this to stick. All the extra Scultamold in the back will push out around the edges and help fill in the gaps and help everything blend together nicely. The rock molds are great, but alternatively you can just slap this Scultamold grout mix straight onto the foam edge to help build up a more random, natural looking edge. And then blending it in with the rest of the cliff faces and rock molds. And once this is dry, we just come back in with the exact same leopard spotting technique from beginning to end to help blend all these new pieces in with the board. And now that we're done with the major rock faces, it's time to move on to the earth. For the first layer of the earth, I'm going to mix up some grouts with a little bit of Mod Podge, PVA and paint. By using a couple of different colors of grout, I'm hoping to get a bit more of a natural variation in the base. Using grout for this mix is better than sand because eventually once it's all dry, the scale is going to look much better with your miniatures. And once we've got it all mixed up, we just start spreading it all over the flat surfaces of the board. Trying not to get it on our cliff faces, but it's not the end of the world if you do. This first layer not only adds some texture, but helps to seal all of the foam. And now for some more natural variation, I come in with a powdering of the lighter color gravel over the entire thing. Then using a paintbrush, I brush any excess off of the cliffs before coming in with a Mod Podge and water spray to seal everything down. And using this opportunity to add a few more variations of sized gravel and rocks to the board. And once this has been given time to dry, you can see how awesome and natural this earth texture looks. And now it's time to clean up the edges and seal the foam with a mix of Mod Podge and black paint. Framing it in black really helps the whole board to pop. You could easily leave the board like this and it would make for a great playing experience. But I want this design to look a little bit more like a white desert or beach. So I'm going to mix up some lighter coloured grouts and then use the tea strainer to help me spread it out nice and evenly to give a really light covered top layer to all of the earthen textures. So I carefully go around spraying all of the flat surfaces with the Mod Podge sealant mix and then come through with the tea strainer, giving a nice light layer. Eventually blasting off all of the excess with a leaf blower. This was a terrible idea and led to a lot more cleanup. So I decided to shift up my method and come in with that paintbrush and really just give the whole thing a brush down to help spread around all the colors and combine them together, as well as removing any excess that hadn't stuck down. Finally, I came back in with one more layer of the watered down brown paint to bring back all of the shadows in the rock surfaces and help blend them all together. And now that we're happy with the general design, it's time to add in some grass tufts. Always my favorite part of a build. The only problem was I had to really hold myself back since the desert wouldn't really be full of life. So I stuck with dark brown and beige coloured tufts and really just tried to keep them into the sides, where seeds might have been blown by the wind and caught in the rocks. Just having a few of these adds something extra, but still keeps it that nice beachy desert look. And now, time to throw down some miniatures. And I'm really stoked with how this has turned out. Once I put everything on the board, it looks awesome. The realistic rock textures and just a small smattering of plants has really brought the whole thing to life. And I really feel like this is going to play well across both sci-fi and fantasy. This is by far the biggest board that I have made yet, and I only want to go bigger. Once, of course, I figure out the storage solutions. A possible idea I have for some future videos to solve this is to rebuild this board into something different, maybe regreening it or building some beach expansions to really give it a nice Kashyyyk vibe. Once I put those Wookiees down, I just had that Star Wars imagery. I really like the idea of this board being able to be used in both sci-fi and fantasy, and I kind of want to play around with that going forward. So let's see what happens next. And remember, never stop making stuff.